Well, thank you very much, Bettina, for this incredibly kind introduction and really for having me. And thank you, all of you, for coming back after lunch instead of having a post-lunch slumber and instead listening to this hopefully reawakening talk. It's always a challenge to speak after lunch, but it's a particular challenge to speak after lunch if you just had people like David French or Sam Perry talk before you and setting the scene so very nicely. But I'll do my utmost to live up to the very high bar set by the previous speakers. And I'll try to do so by really talking about the two big topics that, as just was mentioned, my research is about, the two big topics that you aren't supposed to talk about over polite lunch or dinner conversation, namely religion and politics, in particular, perhaps to some particularly unsavory combination of the two, namely the relationship between Christianity and right-wing populism. And I do that very much from a comparative basis. So as you can hear from the accent, I'm German with a bit of a British twang. And I do basically the comparison between Western Europe and the United States, trying to understand this relationship between the far right and religion. But before really going into the nitty-gritty of this relation, and in an effort to basically drag you out of the post-lunch coma, I thought I'd start by taking you onto a little imaginary journey through a couple of Western cities in these last few years. And let's begin maybe in my own home country, in Germany, and more particularly in Dresden. I don't know whether any of you have ever been to Dresden. It's a beautiful Baroque city. It's Germany's capital of Baroque. And I just want you to basically imagine yourself walking through these beautiful Baroque streets on a cold winter evening. And then as you come into the main market square, imagine yourself suddenly coming across this huge crowd of people. Several thousand of them gathered around the Frauenkirche, the main Protestant church in Dresden, and the people are singing church hymns. They are carrying candles. Some of them are holding up oversized crosses. And then let's imagine that the second stop of our journey takes us to Paris in France, a few hundred kilometers to the west, where once again we meet a huge crowd of people, several thousand, this time gathered around the statue of a Catholic saint. And they are preparing to march through the streets of this French capital of secularism. They are preparing to march through the streets of Paris in the veneration of that Catholic saint. And then finally, let's imagine that our journey takes us to the other side of the Atlantic, to this side of the Atlantic, and more specifically to Washington, D.C., where yet again we meet a crowd of several thousand people. They too are carrying crosses, they are waving Jesus Saves flags, and they are blaring Christian music from their speakers. Now, what is interesting about these three events is that none of them took place in the context of a religious service, procession, or any other form of religiously organized gathering, but that all three were set up and organized by right-wing populist movement. The first one that you can see here is a demonstration by Pegida, the Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamization of the Occident. German far right likes it pithy and short. The second one is taken from a demonstration of the French Rassemblement National in the annual gathering in the honor of Joan of Arc. And the third, of course, were scenes all too familiar to many of you from the pro-Trump protests that turned into the deadly and bloody riots around the US Capitol in January 2021. And these three events are actually representative of two broader trends that we can currently observe in almost each Western society across both Europe and the United States, with on the one hand, the rise of right-wing populism, of these movements and parties that are no longer marginal movements, but in many countries can win election and form majorities, even governments. And then on the other hand, in parallel to that in many ways, the resurgence of references to religion, and specifically to Christianity, in the political debate of many European countries that until very recently, most academics would have agreed are very highly secularized, or at least on the path towards further secularization. And given the nature of the events I just described, one may now, of course, be very much tempted to think that this is actually just one and the same thing. This is just, in many ways, a reactionary backlash of conservative Christianity against the advance of secular liberal society. And as we've seen with the presentation, especially of Sam, I think there's a really important, there is something to it. It's really important to recognize the tradition of white Christian nationalism in the far right. But what I'm trying to look at with a comparative perspective is also to see not just the role of religion in far right, the role of religion in far right movements, but also the role compared to other wings, to other currents in the far right across different countries. And here, because there we actually see a lot of complexity if we look across different countries. Because in the US, of course, we see this enormous support of not just white evangelicals, but also white Catholics, mainline Protestants, for Donald Trump, both in 2016 and 2020, and it looks like it wouldn't be very different in 2024 as well if Trump did become the Republican nominee. But if we look to Europe, we actually see that there the situation is very different. Because in Europe, supporters of the far right actually tend to be disproportionately irreligious. So if we take just this example of Dresden that we still have here, there was a survey taken at the evening of that very demonstration. And it turned out that of these people running around with these oversized crosses, over 80% self-identified as atheist or irreligious, and only a tiny minority self-identified as Christian. And it's actually something we can see throughout a lot of Western Europe, where things such as church attendance are really powerful predictors against voting for the populist right. So the question is now, of course, how can we explain this paradoxical relationship? How can we explain these very paradoxical expressions of this relationship between, on the one hand, the rise of the populist right, and then on the other hand, the way it relates to religion in different countries? And what I try to do in my book and in my research more broadly, in which I try to replicate to some extent in my talk here, is to approach this question basically in 4 steps. With, first of all, looking at the social origins of right-wing populism. Here I really want to understand what drives this movement, because it's clearly not something limited to just one single country. There seems to be something going on sociodemographically in Western societies that creates demand, that creates a fertile breeding ground for the populist right. So what are the sociodemographic drivers of the rise of right-wing populism? Why is it happening now, and to what extent are the developments we can see in different countries actually comparable? The second question is then to look at how religion fits actually into that. What do right-wing populists in different countries actually mean when they talk about Christian identity, and how does that compare, for instance, to religious references of, say, a Christian Democratic Party in Europe, like the party of Angela Merkel, or even religious references by people like Joe Biden or George W. Bush when he talked about compassionate conservatism. And the third question is then to look at how the strategy works out in practice. How do Christian communities actually react to that? And once again, I like looking here at the variation between different countries, which then, of course, brings us to the fourth and final point of which factors determine how Christian communities react, and what does that mean for the future of the church in society and the future of religion in politics going forward. But first things first, what are the social roots of right-wing populism? And here the key finding, the key takeaway of my research has really been that the surge of right-wing populism is to a large extent the consequence of the emergence of a new social cleavage, a new social divide, centered less around the question of economics or theological debate, but much more around the question of identity, the question of how to define national identity, how to define the us, and how to define the other. How to say who belongs, who may belong, and who may not. And for all of you who had better things to do in their 20s than doing a social science PhD, very briefly, social cleavages are basically the main social divides within a society that shape the political system of a country and the parties that populate it. And historically, across Western societies, we basically had two dominant social cleavages, with on the one hand, an economic cleavage between basically the workers and the capitalists, or a state-run economy and a free market economy. That's, if you are a Marxist, you will call this the class struggle. And then on the other hand, you have basically the religious or cultural or moral cleavage between social conservatives and secular liberals. And for most of the 20th century, as a result, our politics were dominated, on the one hand, by questions about economic redistribution, taxation and class relations, as well as by social, moral, and religious issues such as abortion, church-state relations, and sexual freedom. And historically, we could also fit most of our parties pretty straightforwardly in this 2-by-2 metrics, with, for instance, conservative parties. These are European parties, but you can do the same with Democrats and Republicans. Conservative parties basically being more on the social conservative end of things and on the free market end of things, and progressive or social democratic party more on the state interventionist and social liberal side of things. But what is interesting is that if we start looking at the populist right as a party family, so not just one movement in one country, but really the movements. And the nice thing is they come together. So they come together in conferences and they will say, we are together the populist movement. Steve Bannon has been great for my research because he basically created a federation of international nationalists and said, we are part of one and the same movement. But if you look at these parties across countries, it's actually really interesting because they don't really fit into this 2-by-2 matrix anymore. They actually oscillate across the party family, but often even within the same party over time. They oscillate both on the economic cleavage and also on the religious cleavage. On the economic cleavage, you will have a lot of very free market-oriented, if you think about the Tea Party movement, but also the early AfD in Germany, you have a lot of these parties that are very, very clear in the free market area. But then you also have, and sometimes even the same party, a couple of years later saying, oh no, actually, we want to be on the blue-collar side of the divide. We are now protectionist. We are now against global trade agreements. We are now in favor of a very strong welfare state. In France, for instance, the Rassemblement National, if you only look at the economic policy, it's pretty much copy-paste from the Socialist Party in France. And what is interesting is that is not just limited to the economic divide, but if you look at it broadly, you can actually see also a lot of oscillation on the religious and moral cleavage. I mean, that might be surprising, especially to an American audience where the GOP and especially Trumpism, you have this alliance in a way between the far right and the Christian right. But if you look more broadly in Europe, you can actually see a lot of right-wing populist leaders who then come to speak at GOP conferences, and they will actually say, no, we are the real defenders of gay rights against reactionary Islam, or we are the real defenders of the separation of state and church against the influence of Muslim immigrants, or we are the real defenders of women's rights. Once again, it's not necessarily whether you take that for granted, whether you take that very seriously is entirely up to you, but the very fact that they, in their own rhetoric, are so flexible about that suggests that what connects these parties is neither economics, nor is it really religion and theology, but it is something different. And indeed, if you look at the surveys of what drives the supporters of the populist right, you can actually see that it's identitarian issues like immigration, national culture, national identity, that in the thinking of these voters significantly trump economic or moral or religious concerns. And what this suggests is that basically what we are seeing at the moment is, to some extent, the erosion of traditional sources of identity in Western societies. We are seeing trends such as secularization, individualization, the erosion of class identity, basically eroding traditional identities that have fueled these traditional divides, and instead somewhat of a crisis of identity in parts of the population. And what basically comes out of that are two visions of how to respond to that. On the one hand, You have a much more globalist, cosmopolitan approach focused on universalism, multiculturalism, and diversity that embraces group identities, primarily for minorities, but suggests to transcend group identities for the majority population, focus instead on individualist identities for the majority population. And on the other hand, opposed is a communitarian approach that focuses much more clearly on predefined national identity markers such as inherited group identity, like ethnicity, culture, history, institutions, geography, and language. And I'm not the first one talking about that. There's a lot of literature about that. In the UK, people usually talk about the divide between the somewheres and the anywheres. Others talk about the divide between nationalists and globalists, communitarians and cosmopolitans. But whatever you want to call it, it's quite clear that it is with regards to this new identity divide that right-wing populists now try to come in and politicize this new social cleavage with their own form, in a way, of identity politics. And it's quite interesting because they try to use similar vocabulary of left-wing identity politics about rights and group identity, etc. But they reverse it by saying we are not defending the rights of minorities, we are defending the rights of the majority in inverted commas. But the crucial difference is here that also implies cultural hegemony. Now the question is, of course, I've talked a lot about right-wing populism, but the question is, of course, how does religion now fit into this? And here it's been quite clear, sorry, there's just more of that. It's been quite clear in my research that it came out that right-wing populists use Christian language, use Christian symbols, primarily as a cultural identity marker in the context of this right-wing identity politics. But at the same time, they often are quite open in staying distanced from religious beliefs and institutions. And to try to better understand this dynamic, it's often useful to think of the right-wing populist worldview basically as a triangular relationship. With, on the one hand, the pure, the good, the homogeneous people. That's the us, that's the good guys, that's the offer of identity that they make. But this pure people is both threatened and defined in relation to a set of two others. On the one hand, you have the corrupted liberal elite. That's the other from within that threatens the identity from within. And then on the other hand, you have the external others, which through their very cultural otherness, the existence of their cultural otherness, are undermining the identity of the us. And what is interesting is that if you look at the far-right rhetoric over the last couple of decades, there's been a shift in the definition of the external other. And it's going away from national ethnic identity markers, and it's much more defined in cultural, civilizational, and specifically religious terms as the Islamic other. And it's really interesting that it's very often only given this religious definition of the other, that in far-right rhetoric, Christianity comes in as an analogous cultural identifier of the us. But what that is, especially in Europe, we can see it quite clearly, is not necessarily return of religious fervor or religious practice into secular societies, but much rather culturalization, perhaps even to some extent a secularization of the very concept of religion itself. Religion here really purely as a cultural identifier of the nation that in some ways just becomes a symbol of whiteness, and in this regard, interchangeable with other symbols of whiteness. This is why you can, for instance, have people carrying around big, oversized crosses in the German national colors. This is why in the Capitol riots you could see people running around with crosses right next to a neo-pagan shaman, or people in Viking veneer, because it's interchangeable in some ways as symbols of whiteness, and in some ways we even see a clear dissociation here of belief and belonging, of religion as a faith, from religion as a cultural identifier. And I saw that really clearly in my own research. I interviewed about 140 people for the book, and I talked to right-wing populist leaders, I talked to mainstream party politicians, and I talked to clergy. And one of the questions I would ask all of them is, what do you actually mean when you talk about Christian identity? What does that actually mean to you? How would you define that? And it was really striking when I asked that question to clergy, but also to mainstream politicians, whether they're center-left or center-right, they would almost all start talking to me about theology. They start talking about sinfulness, the resurrection, the Trinity, the second coming of Christ. By contrast, when I asked the very same question to right-wing populist leaders, almost all of them would start talking to me about culture, history, geography, music, architecture, etc., etc. Never about theology. And what is really striking, almost all of them also started to talk about Islam in their definition of Christian identity. They would say, we are Christian because we have a church in the village and not a mosque. We might not go to that church, but it still matters. We are Christian because we have Sundays off and not Fridays off. We might, again, not go to church on that day, but it matters. We are Christian in many ways because we aren't Muslim. And just to give you some quotes about that, they've been very, very open. This is why I just throw some of those on here, in really saying that. So one of the AfD leaders, very, very high-level leader in the AfD, said very clearly to me that in the AfD, that's the German far-right party, the consensus is that when we say Christian or Occident, we mean it in historical and cultural terms, rather than theological terms. It's about defending our culture against other civilizations and the threat of Islam. And what was really interesting, in France we saw similar developments, what was really interesting was that even in the US, even though the GOP is otherwise quite clearly positioned as presenting itself as the Christian party, even there I would talk to members of the Trump administration and they would say very clearly that taking back our country now doesn't mean Christianity in the way it meant in the 80s. Now it means nationalism. It's less religious, it's more political. There's no doubt about that. And what was then very often striking to me was that underneath these identitarian references to Christianity, where Christianity is really just about identity, where not only, let's say, it's not that they don't care about Christianity, I actually often found explicitly anti-Christian currents in these parties. So to once again just give you a couple of quotes, we had some politicians who told me that actually there are many people in the AfD who outwardly say that Christianity is extremely important to them and that they are Christians themselves, but who internally always fought the Christians in the party. They really wanted to destroy us. For these people, Christianity is just a religion from the Near East that does not fit into Germany. And you can have these criticisms from different sides. You will have some people who are very neo-Nietzschean in a way and just say like Christianity is the slave religion for the weak. We don't want that. It's just a Jewish sect. We don't want that. And you will have other people who will say, oh no, actually it's just from the past. We are now secular. We are now modernist. Christianity is just history. So, for instance, in the French Rassemblement National, and that's actually Jean-Marie Le Pen who said that, the founder of the Front National, he said like, now clearly the dominant force in our party is secular. To be sure, in the United States, things are much different, because I don't think even anywhere in the Republican Party, not even in the most extreme parts of the Trump campaign, would anybody be that open about criticisms of Christianity. But it is interesting that we can still see somewhat of a shift, somewhat of a change within the Republican Party, because unlike earlier Republican candidates, Trump actually sounds much more European in his references to Christianity. It's much less about personal piety or theological values, and it's much more about this culture war. It's much more about really fighting the other and really Christianity as the tribal religion. And as a result, it is not entirely surprising that some of the most adamant supporters of Trumpism, large parts of the alt-right, you will see things like neo-pagan symbolism, neo-pagan rhetoric, and they will be, once again, if you talk even to people like Steve Bannon or Steve Miller, they will not talk to you about their intellectual influences through, I don't know, reading Billy Graham or any evangelical thinkers. They will start talking to you about European authors. A lot of the members of the Trump campaign talked to me about Charles Maurras, who is a French historian here, and who said, for instance, who got thrown out of the Catholic Church because he said, we are all atheists, but we want basically a zombie religion. We want Catholicism without God. And that is a concept that is really popular in parts of the new right. And that is actually something that's interesting because that wasn't that present in the United States before, and that's coming over from Europe now in many ways. So in some ways we actually see a Europeanization also of parts of the American right. And that's really interesting because on the other hand, we have this tradition of white Christian nationalism. And the two coming together is a really, really interesting dynamic, which then also, of course, brings us to the question, how does this work out in practice? How do Christian communities actually react to that? And what is interesting here is, of course, what I mentioned earlier, we see a lot of variation. We see in the United States, of course, the overwhelming support of white evangelicals and white Christians for Donald Trump. But if we look to Europe, once again, we see the contrary. And I just gave you the examples of Germany because it's just very nicely shown there. And I've looked at the election results of the last 20, 30 elections, and you can see that throughout the elections, the AfD on average is about double as strong among irreligious voters and atheists than they are among Protestants and Catholics. And we can see that again in other European countries as well, where things such as church attendance are a very strong predictor for not voting for the far right, with some scholars now even going so far to speak of a religious vaccination effect against the far right, or religious immunity against the far right. And it's of course like the question now arises, why is that so different between the US and Europe? And one thing that I think is actually interesting is also to see change over time. Because I think Sam showed very clearly that now we actually see that often also the most religious people are the most supportive of Trumpism. But that wasn't that way in the very beginning. If you actually looked at the primary in 2015-16, Trump initially did best among those Republican primary voters who didn't go to church, whereas he significantly underperformed among those who went to church most frequently. And the question is, of course, how did that change? Why did that change? What are the factors determining that? And I basically want, in the fourth step, look at two factors in particular. The one is the behavior of the mainstream political parties. That means the competition, so to speak. And here in particular, we see that one really crucial role is the availability of, so to speak, Christian alternatives in the party system, because here the logic is in many ways that Christian voters usually are already bound to traditional conservative parties. So if you think about the 2x2 metrics in a way, religious voters were very much politicized around the religious cleavage and therefore with the traditional conservative party. And therefore, when the new party arrives with the identitarian divide, the identitarian cleavage, that's comparatively less important to these voters. It's much more important to, say, for instance, to voters of the more secularized white working class. And if such an alternative is then available, like the Christian Democrats in Europe, you can actually see that Christians just vote for this party because they've always voted for this party. There's an alternative. It's not that they are in many ways more or less radical in their anti-immigrationist views than their secular neighbors, but they just have this alternative. However, if this alternative is non-existent or taken over by a populist movement, as some would say the Republican Party is in the processes of becoming a Trumpist party, then this vaccination effect simply breaks down, because the voters will stick to the party that they adhered to previously. But the fact I really want to focus on more in the last 6 minutes of the presentation is actually one that is, because the political availability hypothesis has been discussed a lot in the literature, but one thing that has been discussed much less is the role of faith leaders and religious institutions themselves, in particular their ability to either legitimize the far right or to create a social taboo around them. And scholars have long emphasized the importance of elites in creating social taboos and thereby shaping social and political behavior of voters, and in particular of Christian voters, because churches are such normative organizations that really set normative boundaries. And we can really see that very clearly, the role that, for instance, the churches in Europe have played in this respect. Because if you look at the example of Germany, Germany's churches have actually been really been able to create quite a powerful social taboo around the far right by positioning themselves very clearly in the pro-immigration camp, demonstrating at AfD party conferences with slogans like "Our cross is no swastika," or by banning far-right leaders from church positions. The German churches, whether Catholic or Protestant, have in this way really become some of the most outspoken public critics of the far right. And as a result, if you are a church-going Christian in Germany or in France or the Netherlands, there's not a lot of social cost if you then say, I vote for the far right. Because there is this very clear normative authority by the religious elites that are saying that is not a Christian alternative. As a good Christian, you ought not to vote in that way. So once again, it's sometimes less about attitudes, but in a way, German or European Christians don't act on anti-immigrant attitudes to the same extent as in the US. Conversely, if faith leaders are for whatever reason unable or unwilling to create this social taboo, this then weakens or even reverses the religious vaccination effect. And here, once again, the comparison with the US was really fascinating for me, because one thing that actually surprised me to some extent was that when I talked to religious leaders in the US, and even people in Donald Trump's Faith Advisory Board, privately they would actually be quite similar to European leaders in their criticism of saying, like, this is not our guy. We don't really like him. It's like the least bad choice, etc., etc. So there, in some ways, you didn't only have people like David French, who was here earlier, or Russell Moore, who openly criticized Trump, but you also had a lot of people who were privately quite critical, and there's like interesting survey material from the National Association of Evangelicals, for instance, that in 2016, most pastors were actually very critical of Trump. They didn't like him. However, this initial skepticism did not translate to the same social taboo as, for instance, in Germany. And I think there are a couple of also structural reasons for that. One reason is faith leaders' willingness to speak out. So in some ways, and here I think we will talk about that maybe in the panel later, the structural relationship of church and state plays an important role here. Because in Europe we have a lot of institutionalized churches or state churches. And if you are sitting in the House of Lords as a bishop, it's really hard to make a claim that you are a populist anti-elitist. Whereas in the US, it's much easier, because of the very strong separation, to say, like, we are the underdogs. We have a victimhood narrative. We are really the anti-elitist bit, and it makes it easier so it's, in some ways, for the Europeans, it's very hard to not condemn the far right because they are per se anti-populist, because they're part of the establishment. Another point is access to policymakers. So in Europe, once again, you have actually institutionalized access to policymakers, so you can in some way speak your mind publicly without consequences. Whereas in the US, it was very interesting. I talked to a lot of people who say, like, yeah, I would have continued to criticize Trump, but you only get access through personal connection. You can only get access if you don't criticize publicly. And that muted the criticism of some. At least this is what they would use as an excuse. And finally, also church internal power dynamics. Because in Europe, it's quite clear, if you have a pope, or if you have a conference of bishops, and only one church, and they say that's not a good thing to do, or like they go one way or the other, it's very clear that the hierarchy is such that also all the other priests, and in the end also the congregations, will go in that way. By contrast, in the United States, it's much more bottom-up. So there's much more, the congregation pushes for one thing or the other, and very often the leadership follows. So that's about the willingness about publicly opposing the populist right. The second thing is also ability, though. Because even if you do speak out in the United States, it's often much harder to speak out against the populist right for a couple of reasons. One is just because it's harder to identify who speaks for Christianity if you have thousands of denominations, whereas in Europe you have a Catholic Church, maybe one Protestant church, and if you have the two agree, they can really ex officio to some extent say one thing or the other, and that is then received as as the position of the church, whereas here, of course, it's not clear. There's nobody who can, through their office, speak on behalf of Christianity more broadly. And then another thing is also, once again, what Sam mentioned earlier, it's the self-sorting. If you go to church, like I'm Lutheran in Germany, and if I go to church in Germany, I want to go to church in Germany, it just depends where I live. It's a parish system. So I move, and there's one church for my neighborhood, and that's it. Don't do church shopping. Whereas in the United States, because you have this marketplace of religion, if you go to a church and you don't like what you hear, you can go to another church. You can sort yourself into a group that agrees with you. Whereas I'm stuck with my church. And if the pastor tells me something I don't like to hear, I have to keep listening to them, because if I go to another church, they're like, why did you leave your church? Like, it's a very different also degree of deference. So I think these roles are really important in explaining the existence of a social taboo, of the role and the ability of faith leaders to create this social taboo, and as a result also of the behavior of Christian voters. Now, I don't want to say that necessarily church leaders should always speak out against the populist right, because that can also have very negative consequences. It can contribute to social exclusion or radicalization of church members. It can also really risk politicizing Christianity. But basically the point I want to make here is that some of these data points actually show that there is a tremendous potential that church and faith leaders still have. So it's not that one is just an observer who can't do anything, but you actually have quite a lot of leverage and impact. And I know that I'm running over, so I'll basically leave it like that with a couple of questions, though I think you probably have much better questions than me. But basically to ask whether the emergence of right-wing populism is just a threat, or perhaps in some ways even a corrective to an old party system which is based on old political cleavages that are also changing sociologically, whether religion is a fuel or a barrier to the surge of the populist right, and what that means for the future of faith in society, whether we are seeing really a sacralization of the secular return of religion to politics, or not also to some extent the secularization of the sacred religion becoming to some extent something of a zombie religion that is really much more about identity than about faith. I don't have all the answers to that, but nor does Mr. Trump. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you so much for not falling asleep again after lunch.
So I'm interested in the way that you were able to sort of explain the thinking of the populist movement in sort of dividing between the elites and, I guess, those who shouldn't be part of the community. One of the fascinating things that in terms of looking at how this has developed in the United States, is that this populist movement has chosen as their spokesperson someone who is from the elite and has lived as an elite all his life. How do you explain that phenomenon?
No, I mean, I think it's absolutely fascinating what you say, and actually Trump in this respect is no exception. If you look, I've visited Jean-Marie Le Pen, who's the founder of the French Rassemblement National, in his gorgeous mansion in the suburbs of Paris, and like almost all of the far-right leaders I met went to very elite universities. And in some ways they are part of the elite. But I think what the appeal is for many people is that although they're part of the elite, they're also the part of the elite that really annoys the other part of the elite. So in some ways, it's, and I don't want to be too graphic, but like one interview has described it to me like that. I like Trump because he's basically the biggest middle finger I could find to show to the liberal elite. And that it was not actually anything that he does or is, it's just like that it's almost ex negativo. It's out of the negative. It's because that is the thing that the liberal secular elite, or how you might perceive them, is not. And I think that is actually really important, that in some ways the right-wing populist worldview is not a group of positive ideas. It's much more defined out of a negative. against something. And it's actually quite interesting historically, if you look at some of the developments, for instance, around the vaccines, you had anti-vax movements in large parts of Europe before the far right wasn't anti-vax. And then the elites, in some ways, told them to get vaccinated, and then they started saying, oh no, vaccination is bad. But this wasn't, we are going to look at the vaccination and what's the science on that. It was like, okay, if people say it's good, it must be bad. So I think that it is an interesting dynamic, but they often, I think many right-wing populist leaders are just because they're the most outrageous parts of the elite in the way they deal with their with the perceived liberal elite.
And the question from the audience, do you see a sort of populist movement emerging among the sort of left?
Yeah, no.
And in relation to the right-wing populist movements?
Back to the definition I had here, because what's interesting about that is that if there is a populist left, there's also left-wing populism. Left-wing populism is basically this. So you take away the external other to some extent. And it's much more really about us, the people, versus them, the corrupted elite. It's also quite binary. Some scholars actually say that they also have an external other, and that the external other in some ways is anybody who politically disagrees. Or that the external other is, in the UK we say the white van man, or the white working class. It's in some liberal circles, it's actually quite okay to talk, for instance, about white working class people in ways that you wouldn't be allowed to talk about any other marginalized community. So some would even say there is an external other, but traditionally in the literature people would say what the populism is really this binary relationship between us, the people, and them, the elite. It's the anti-elitism. And it's when the external other comes in that it becomes right-wing in a way.
And what recommendation would you make to societies grappling with sort of bridging the divide created by populism and sort of bringing people together? What recommendations would you make?
I can only refer to St. Perry. I think in many ways, precisely is the problem of polarizing. And it's, in some ways, this is a different, so the cleavage system is a different way of thinking of the concentric circles. What you basically want is not just one dominant divide, because then it's just all about identity politics, and you're all grouped about one divide, and everybody thinks the same. What you actually want, actually in some ways it's counterintuitive, but you want to have a lot of divides within society, because that means you will end up on a lot of different ends of different divides that bring you together with different people. So you might be on the identity cleavage, you might be on a globalist point of view, if you're, I don't know, a Catholic immigrant from Mexico, you might be in favor of immigration. But you might also be on the social and moral, on the moral and religious divide. You might actually be with the Republicans. So then all of a sudden you have this tension, and that's once again what we mentioned earlier. I think if you feel too comfortable with the people in the bubble around you, there's probably something wrong. You almost want to be with people you disagree with, and actually, the good thing in Europe in some ways is that although churches have huge problems, even bigger problems than in the United States in terms of membership, but the membership is still quite diverse, both racially and politically, and that churches in many ways are the only few places where you will find people from the far left and the far right sit in the same pews, agreeing about something in their faith, and then being able to see each other as human beings when they talk to one another about politics. And I think that is really the key we have to get. You have to go into the communities that don't agree with you and talk to the various opinions and people with opinions that disagree with you.
Okay. And in terms of populism in Europe, can you just expand on how Islamic immigration has sort of led to the growth of populism?
So it's really interesting that you say Islamic immigration, because we had first waves of immigration in the 1990s that are actually comparable to what we have now in the 2010s and 2020s. But back then, you would have also the surge of far-right parties, but they would talk about, in Germany, oh, these Turks are all coming to Germany. Or in France, they would say, oh, all these Tunisians are now coming, the Maghrebians, they're all coming to France. But it was national. What is interesting this time round is that Turks have become Muslims, and Moroccans have become Muslims, and Tunisians have become Muslims in the perception. And that is an interesting shift in the rhetoric of the far right. And that is something that is basically, since the early 2000s, there's a lot of disagreement why that is, but basically what we are seeing is a shift from nationalism and ethnic divide towards more civilizationism, and a bit the idea of the clash of civilization. I think the challenge is, first of all, to understand why that is. And actually, historically, the US has been much better in this respect. I mean, the US has like huge problems with structural racism and racial divides, but historically, the US has been much better than Europe in integrating religious minorities. Because we said, like, oh, whether you're Muslim or Jew or Christian, it doesn't matter, because you're a person of faith, that's a good thing. So you can integrate. So for instance, on average, Muslims in the US are much better integrated than in Europe, where in Europe people were almost saying, and I think it might actually even have something to do with secularism, because Europe is so secular that if you come into the country and you go to mosque and you are religious, that's weird. And there's actually a very high level of people not really knowing how to deal with religion itself. And it's really interesting, you have analogously to prejudice about Islam, there's actually also a lot of prejudice in the German far right, for instance, about evangelicals, like people who come from the Caribbean, who come from Pentecostalists from sub-Saharan Africa, and people will just not understand this is culturally different. So in some ways, I think it's important also to recognize that there can also be a secular anti-religious right that is not necessarily significantly more accommodating or welcoming to outsiders than a religious right.
We're out of time.
Thank you.